Project Stargate. If you've watched Stranger Things, then this one probably sounds familiar to you. In the show, 11 started off as an experiment to psychically spy on the Russians, and turns out this was actually real. In the 1970s in California and later in Maryland, the CIA recruited numerous men and women who claimed they had ESP, or extrasensory perception. People with ESP typically say that they can read minds or move objects without touching them. They were recruited to try and help uncover military and domestic intelligence secrets. Mostly they just wanted them to spy on the Russians by reading their minds. The government covered it up, of course, because why would they want people knowing they're trying to use magic powers to win a war? But in 2017, when 12 million pages of records were declassified, all of the information about the so-called Project Stargate became public knowledge. People learning that they had been using the men and women to locate hostages and even track fugitives throughout the states. Number 9. Vault 7. Vault 7 was definitely never meant to make it to the public eye, but unfortunately for the CIA, it got leaked. So what actually is Vault 7? Back in 2017, WikiLeaks started releasing a series of CIA documents. Vault 7 was a group of documents that contained hacking systems that were either developed or otherwise obtained by the CIA. For the most part, it should make you wary of your technology and how the government is using it. Many people know that apps will track our searches and data to learn about us and maybe even sell it to malicious companies, but it's much more than that. Weeping Angel has the ability to turn a Samsung television into a recording device, even if it appears that your television is switched off. Vault 7 also contained the ability to intercept all your iPhone messages before they got encrypted through apps like WhatsApp, Signal, and Telegram. And according to the documents, the CIA can allegedly take over your phone by exploiting vulnerabilities, but Apple has said that they patch these vulnerabilities as soon as they're aware of them. Number 8. Battalion 316. Intelligence Battalion 316 went through a few different names throughout its existence, but it was pretty much always functioning for the same reason. They were an army unit in Honduras that was responsible for carrying out political assassinations, and even kidnapping and causing pain to people who were seen as potential political competition throughout the 1980s. The group received both support and training from the CIA, even receiving their training at United States military bases. They were a military kill squad that definitely wasn't known for being friendly, committing various crimes like terrorism, misogyny, ethnic cleansing, and even so-called crimes against humanity. Their goal to remain in power in Honduras failed, leaving behind a long list of innocent victims. In 1996, members of the US Congress asked President Bill Clinton to release the documentation about the country's involvement with the human rights violations that took place in Honduras, and this is when we learned about the battalion. Number 7. MK-Ultra. Let's once again return to the Red Scare and the United States fight against Russians and communism. During the Cold War, they came under the belief that the communists had invented a drug that would allow them to control human minds, and the US wanted a piece of that, starting their own research into the technique under the name Project MK-Ultra, trying to find their own mind control substance that could be turned into a weapon. It ran from the 50s to the 60s and led to many unknowing or even unwilling subjects being given illicit substances. The experiments were apparently covertly funded in American universities and research facilities, but it turns out that the experiments also took place in prisons and detention centers in the US, Japan, Germany, and the Philippines. The goal was to destroy the current mind and replace it with something new. Attempts included using electric shocks and illicit substances. For some, the experiments were fatal, and many others had their lives completely changed. Number 6. Operation Cyclone. Operation Cyclone became known as one of the longest and most expensive covert operations taken on by the CIA, costing around $630 million per year for a whole decade. So what was Operation Cyclone, and why was the government pouring so much cash into it? It was an operation that worked to arm and finance militant Islamic groups during the military intervention by the USSR. The goal was to aid anti-Soviet resistance businesses outside of the United States. They gave loans, aircrafts, weapons, and other military assistance to the groups in Afghanistan, costing the United States government billions of dollars for these so-called care packages. Eventually, the Soviets were pushed out of Afghanistan, but conspiracy was still spinning. Many of the weapons ended up being sold in local markets instead of going to the rebels, and some people believe that Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda received assistance from the US military. Number 5. Operation Ajax. In the 1950s, a coup took place in Iran, and the CIA documents about it weren't released until they were pressured to a total 64 years later. As it turns out, the agency played a large role in the coup that led to the end of the current Iranian prime minister, a rise in nationalism, and sour US-Iranian relationships remaining into the 21st century. The motivation was oil. The US and UK wanted Iran's oil, but their new prime minister made it inaccessible to them, so the two countries conspired to overthrow him and get their oil back. The coup seemed to fail, and the CIA sent a message to their base in Iran calling it off, but the CIA officer who received it said, "Nah, we're not done here." So the next day, with crowds allegedly hired by the CIA, the coup, or Operation Ajax, went through and the prime minister was overthrown, the monarchy and oil fields restored in the country, anti-Western sentiment also being restored and growing to new and extreme levels. Number 4. The Five Eyes. Are you familiar with one of the farthest reaching intelligence and espionage agencies in the world? You are probably a part of it and don't even know it. It is the once secret Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. After World War II, the US and UK came together to create an information sharing alliance as a result of how important communication was for them during the war effort. And in 1956, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were added to this group. The classification status on these documents was USA, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, eyes only. And that was obviously a bit wordy, so they shortened it down to Five Eyes. It has been operating for 70 years now and is used for surveillance and sharing classified information between the 5 countries. The alliance was especially important during the Cold War, when the countries shared a lot of information like the location of Soviet weapons in North America. The alliance was kept a secret until documents of the original UK and USA agreement were released back in 2010. Number 3. Operation PB Success. Similarly to Operation Ajax, Operation PB Success was a covert CIA military operation that took place in another country, this time Guatemala. This was another coup that took place only a year after the one in Iran in 1954. At the time, Guatemala had a very new democracy, only being on their second democratically elected president, but the United States saw him as a threat, this being due to his allowance of the Guatemalan Communist Party to act freely and land reform movements that threatened US industries. The CIA then worked through various different plans of action to overthrow the Guatemalan government, including assassination and faking tensions between the country and Honduras. They spread false information, placed anonymous phone calls, and hired anti-communist students to create a fake opposition. Eventually, the president stepped down and their democracy was seen as unfavorable. The United States training that the Guatemalan military now had led to a war lasting decades, tearing apart the country. But PB Success was a success as it worked, and they were able to deny CIA involvement until the documents were released in 1997. Number 2. The Secret War. We're once again fighting communism, this time in Vietnam, but while the Vietnam War was taking place, a smaller secret war was taking place in Laos, attempting to stop communism from spreading to Southeast Asia. The Americans essentially used the countries of Laos and Cambodia to fight their own war against northern Vietnam and communism, using their tribes as their soldiers. While it was clear that the small armies had no hopes of truly winning against northern Vietnam, the United States and the CIA continued on with their fight, devastating the country and peoples of Laos and Cambodia. They came out of the war with their land and lives completely lost and changed, but the CIA wrote it down in their history books as a success, disregarding the country's sacrifice. The CIA's historical retrospective on the situation not being released until many years later. Number 1. Operation Condor. It's the Cold War again, and the United States government are fighting against terrorism, this time under the codename Operation Condor. It was a campaign of political repression and so-called state terror that was backed by by the US and CIA. It involved many heinous activities like kidnapping, killings, political espionage, and much more, all taking place throughout South America. The CIA chose to describe it as a cooperative effort by the intelligence/security services of several South American countries to combat terrorism and subversion, but really it was a lot more than that. Condor's key members were Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and later Brazil. The United States provided them with planning, coordination, technical support, and military training, all routed through the CIA. It led to many military dictatorships and numerous deaths throughout South America. And there is so much detail and information on this one that if you want it, you're just gonna have to look it up for yourself.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the forgery. So for this one, we are talking about a scandal that happened that was entirely built on a lie, but this scandal is one that affected national politics at the time. So a man named Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army in the late 19th century, but he was accused of treason as it was said he was selling military secrets to Germany. His trial was huge in the media and he ended up being sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, and hateful and prejudiced groups used him as an example of a quote unpatriotic Jewish person. After this sentence, however, people began to suspect that the letters that incriminated him were actually forged and that the real culprit was a major named Charles Esterhazy. It is said that the French authorities tried to suppress these accusations, but a novelist named Émile Zola continued to accuse the army of a cover-up. People were torn at this point. Some people swore that Alfred was still to blame, while others were convinced he was innocent. In the end, the fight became more about the principle rather than whether or not Alfred was really innocent or not. There were 12 years of controversy surrounding this case until Major Hubert Joseph Henry ended up admitting to forging the key documents before taking his own life. The case was finally reopened, and while Alfred was found guilty again, he soon received a pardon from the president. A few years after this, a civilian court of appeals found Alfred innocent as well, and he went on to have quite an army career, and he even fought with honor in the First World War. This was a scandal that really did change French politics forever. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Project. It is said that throughout the last few presidential administrations that the American people were lied to about the progress of the Afghan War, the longest conflict in American history. According to the Washington Post, over 400 different officials, generals, aid workers, diplomats, and Afghan government personnel that were involved in the war deliberately lied to the American people about what was happening in the war, and that they hid evidence that the war had become unwinnable. It is said that the documents that revealed this information were generated by a federal project that aimed to examine all of the causes for the failures of this conflict. The project provided 2,000 pages of notes from interviews with all of those involved. In our number 8 spot today, we have federal spending. So, according to a Harvard Business Review article that was written by Peter Vanderwicken, titled "Why the News is Not the Truth," he claimed that the media and the government are, quote, entwined in a vicious circle of mutual manipulation, myth-making, and self-interest. He uses the effort in the 1980s to eliminate the federal deficit as an example, specifically focusing on the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Amendment. If unfamiliar, this was basically the first binding spending constraints placed on the federal budget. Peter states that for many years there were several media outlets that ran hundreds of stories on the debates over this budget and, quote, the views of all sorts of experts on the urgent need for deficit reduction and the eventual enactment of the legislation. He continues on to say that, quote, anyone who read a newspaper or watched television news received the message that Congress and the Reagan administration were heroically and painfully struggling to contain government spending and reduce the deficit. This is, of course, a list of government lies, so where does that come in? Well, apparently, behind the guise of this diligent work, congressional committees and federal officials were actually increasing spending and adding new programs into the annual spending. Basically, the entire article describes how, quote, journalists conspired with politicians to create an image of a government fighting to end the deficit crisis, but they ignored the routine procedures that increased the deficit. In our number 7 spot today, we have have listening in. Back in 2013, when Edward Snowden released a bunch of classified information and documents, it was leaked that the United States was spying on Germany, France, and Spain. It is said that the government tapped 35 phones, and not just anyone's phone, the phones of world leaders. Of course, when some of them found that out after the leak, they were quick to point out how spying between friends is just not cool. It was, however, also released that world leaders were not the only ones being spied on, as it was found that the NSA was monitoring phone calls in Spain, and these calls were between just anyone. And it wasn't just some here or there, it was said that about 60 million calls were monitored in just 1 month. That's so many! So yeah, everyone was definitely a little annoyed, to say the least, when this information was leaked. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Verizon scandal. Again, back in 2013, The Guardian reported that the Obama administration had allowed the NSA to collect different caller information from Verizon. This is again something that was said to have leaked as part of the information that was released by Edward Snowden, and the information was able to be collected through what was called a quote business records provision of the Patriot Act that was established under the presidency of George W. Bush. It allowed the government to order Verizon to hand over caller information every day. This information included things like the time, location, and the duration of the call. The information began being collected under the Bush administration in 2001, and they were collected from AT&T, Verizon, and Bell South. Of course, once these documents were leaked and this information became public knowledge, US officials began trying to reassure the public that this surveillance was somehow necessary and was actually a program vital to national security, but many people rightfully felt like the spying was an unnecessary invasion of their privacy. This one is tricky because there's definitely a fine line when it comes to things like this. In our number 5 spot today, we have the embassy missions. This is a secret that was hidden from not only the American people, but also the people that were being spied on and listened to, but it wasn't revealed until 2007 when a document was leaked. This document is one that named 38 different embassies and missions that were so-called, quote, targets of US surveillance. The document didn't quite make it clear whether or not these targets were being looked into by only the NSA or if the CIA and FBI were also involved. The document described certain things like bugging fax machines with devices that allowed them to listen in on conversations, and the document also listed the names of different programs that are used within the embassies. The document showed that the embassies targeted weren't just those of countries who seemed to be enemies with the United States, and instead included places like India and Mexico, Greece and Turkey. It appears as if the goal was to gain insider information into the diplomatic relations between the targets in the United States. The EU embassy in Washington, D.C. was one of the targets on this document, and this leak had the potential to have jeopardized one of the largest attempted free trade agreements in the world, because shortly after this all came out, negotiations were set to begin between the EU and the United States. The French president at the time made his anger about the situation very public and stated that all future negotiations will only be made under the agreement that the United States cease all unauthorized surveillance of any EU buildings or personnel. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Pentagon Papers. Former President Lyndon B. Johnson is said to have kept many secrets and lies about the Vietnam War hidden away until a military analyst leaked the records and exposed the truth back in 1971, right in the New York Times. The Pentagon Papers were a very secret Department of Defense study, and the papers, when leaked, told everyone about the extent of America's political and military involvement in the Vietnam War. President Johnson certainly was not the only president named in these papers, as other names included Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy, who is said to have been extremely misleading about the United States' direct involvement in the war. The release of these papers really only fueled people in their protests against the war, and it was also one of the moments where the public lost a lot of trust that they once had in the government. In our number 3 spot today, we have Watergate. This is perhaps one of the largest scandals and leaks in history, especially in the history of the United States. In the middle of 1972, there were 5 men who were arrested for breaking into and subsequently trying to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington, D.C. As the year went on and the 1972 presidential election came closer, there was an anonymous source who fed information to Washington Washington Post reporters that, quote, the Watergate bugging incident stemmed from a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage conducted on behalf of President Nixon's re-election and directed by officials of the White House. Despite this information leak and it being reported to the news, Nixon was still re-elected, but he was also under serious investigation. There was a series of Senate hearings, and the Senate even went on to create a special investigation committee. The hearings were broadcast nationwide, and they had witnesses testifying that Nixon had approved plans to cover up administration involvement in the break-in, and that there was a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office. These hearings captured the attention of Americans everywhere for weeks, and in the end, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to release these Oval Office tapes to government investigators, which then went on to reveal that he had not only attempted to cover up what went on, but he also later tried to use federal officials to deflect the investigation. Under the threat of an imminent impeachment, Nixon had no choice but to admit his guilt and resign, making him the only president to do so. His successor, Gerald Ford, ended up pardoning him, so he escaped prosecution, but there were 69 other people indicted, with 48 of them later being convicted. This is probably the biggest political scandal in US history, and it revealed corruption beyond what Americans at the time could believe, especially after the Pentagon Papers. It truly changed the way people would look at government leaders forever. In our number 2 spot today, we have The Call. So this is a lie, or maybe deception is a better way to put it, but either way, it came to light when the telephone calls of former President Lyndon B. Johnson were revealed. Basically, a phone call somehow came to light that showed that the then presidential candidate, Richard Nixon, might have negotiated behind the president's back with South Vietnam. Allegedly, South Vietnam ended up pulling out of the Paris peace talks after being told that Nixon would get them a better deal once elected. People believe that he did this because he was concerned that an earlier ending to the war would end up derailing his election campaign, since the war was one of the most pressing campaign issues. In the end, Nixon did end up winning the election by less than 1% of the popular vote. For many years, this was speculated and rumors were swirling, but once the phone calls were released, it seemed to confirm what many believed for years. In our number 1 spot today, we have The Big Lie. Okay, we've talked a lot about the United States government today, but of course, that's not the only government that has lied to its people. And some of these definitely aren't the most harmful lies told by the government, but this is one that would certainly make that list. Prior to the 1930s, and really the start of World War II, prejudice against Jewish people was not a new thing. Although the people who we'll call Yahtzees, in order to navigate these online guidelines, began to perpetrate these age-old lies. With the rise in this hateful group came a national policy that was called, quote, the final solution, which is a policy that we all know now was meant to eliminate Jewish people. To accomplish this terrible task, the leader of this group, who we'll call Adolf Hitler, and his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, launched a huge campaign that was meant to spread lies to the German people that would make them believe that Jewish people were their enemies. Some of the lies spread were even ones that dated all the way back to the Middle Ages, and some of them had more modern context but were equally as outrageous, such as the lie spread that suggested Jewish people were to blame for Germany losing World War I. By using Jewish people as scapegoats, they were able to create what is now referred to as the Big Lie.
Kicking off the list at number 10, nuclear site list. Here on Most Amazing, we love lists. I'm not sure if you can tell, but apparently the US government also fancies a list or two. Back when Obama was still running the show, a report was delivered to Congress. Well, it was supposed to be. The 266-page report featured every nook and cranny about the US nuclear program, and it was released publicly on the government printing office's website in draft form by accident. Yeah, just a casual PDF that shows us literal maps to stockpiled fuel used for nuclear warheads back in the day. We love those. The only PDFs I actually enjoy are those ones, actually. Does this stuff happen often? How does this happen? I thought this type of stuff could never happen, right? Well, MIT professor John M. Deutsch said these screw-ups do happen, and it doesn't look like a serious breach. I mean, it certainly sounds serious, but okay, we'll trust the government. Thank you, sir. Let's do it. Number 9, ClimateGate. Yeah, we had a smooth one off the bat, now we're getting right into the serious stuff. Climate stuff. Climate change and stuff. A little different sounding than Watergate, but we'll get to that one later on, obviously. ClimateGate, this was back in 2009 when some hackers some hackers released thousands of emails and files, all from the Climate Research Unit in the UK. These documents, okay, hold on to your butts for this one, they show scientists suppressing the publication of research going against global warming. So this sparked a bunch of bad ideas because at that point in 2009, we just believed it. We just stopped listening at all. Climate change critics were like, aha, I knew it. It was all a conspiracy this whole time. The CRU responded and said the emails were out of context and that the planet is indeed heating up, and we're still in fact burning towards our demise. But these docs leaked literally weeks before the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Denmark, so peculiar timing, I'd say. Science fired back pretty quick. Scientists all around the world were actively proving at that point that humans actively are causing global warming. Today we're scrambling a bit more to figure this one out than 2009. Yeah, a few more of you believe this time around. Number 8. God Save the Queen. This one's quite grim, but I have to talk about it. Have you ever wondered what will happen after the Queen passes away? I mean, I know it's the last thing we want to think about right now because dark, obviously, but it's hard not to think of, especially when Politico magazine releases Operation London Bridge to the public. Yeah, what is that? This magazine somehow got documents showing each and every step in detail what'll happen when that fateful day arrives. There'll be phone calls to the Prime Minister, of course, would be first. Customs require that the Prime Minister is informed by the monarch's private security. Flags will fly at half-mast, of course, but oddly enough in this document the Queen's death is referred to as D-Day. Yeah, 9 days of protocols will follow afterwards, and after a service at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, that's when Queen Elizabeth will be buried with King George VI. It's dark, but I mean, imagine reading about this one morning in 2021. What an odd article. What a brutal way to wake up. Number 7. Secret PowerPoint. Nothing sounds less cool than a leaked 41-slide PowerPoint presentation, but I'll do my best. Here we go. When it comes to the NSA, odds are this PowerPoint is going to be pretty juicy, right? This slideshow was often used to train US intelligence, and I gotta say, 41 pages? That's it? I did 45 on medieval knights in high school. That's all I'm saying, step your game up. This program was called PRISM. You probably heard about this. This is a big deal. And it cost about $20 million a year. This was the highlight of the Snowden leak. PRISM kicked off back in 2007. See, originally they partnered with Microsoft, but once they were attached to Apple come 2012, that's when things got a little dicey, as most things are with Apple. The PowerPoint confirmed that the NSA has access to servers belonging to massive tech giants. Google, Skype, YouTube even, so I don't know, search history, you may want to delete that stuff. There was a summit in California which originally was tense. The United States was accusing China of cyber attack, but right after Edward Snowden leaked the PRISM tea, they didn't have much power at said summit. So China and Europe citizens were obviously not too pleased here. Yeah, leaked data, we don't like hearing about that. This one gets a little worse. Number 6. Big Brother is watching. Even allies of the United States are not safe here, okay? Thanks to Snowden, our boy again, gotta mention him a couple times in this list. At the end of October 2013, it was leaked that the states were spying on Germany, France, and Spain. It's a lot of people, it's a lot of eyes, a lot of spies. The NSA had tapped into 35 phones, not just a couple of dudes. They were spying on 35 world leaders, one of which was German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who called out the NSA after finding out and said this act of snooping was just unacceptable between friends. Ah, brutal. She said the F word too. It's like, hey, we were friends, pal. Don't go through my phone. Don't swipe left in the photos, okay? Betrayal. Well, it was also reported that the NSA was monitoring regular phone calls in Spain for the average folks. So if you thought you were off the hook, you're not, literally and figuratively. They monitored about 60 million calls in 1 month. So yeah, world leader or not, be a little concerned about these guys. Maybe. You know, save some tea for in person. You don't want to give up all that good stuff on the phone. Number 5, leaked voters. Back in December 2015, personal information from 191 million voters was leaked to the public online. Yeah, this feels like yesterday. I remember this all unfolding. I was like, what? How? Researcher Chris Vickery found this data while conducting a security investigation. See, Forbes had described Vickery as, dare I say, a good hacker. They're what's referred to as these white hat hackers. They find weak spots in security without sabotaging or exploding them, you know? Unlike Snowden or other people. That's the key, that's the Donnie difference. 79% of those eligible to vote were the victims here, so it was a big one. All their names, addresses, birth dates, phone numbers, emails, you name it, things you don't want other people knowing, let alone third parties, were all out there. If you could vote, you were exposed. We're still unsure who was behind this entire leak. CSO Online and databreaches.net suggest that the information more than likely came from software provider Nation Builder, but CEO Jim Gilliam announced that that was not the case and they did not create the database. Although he conceded that it is possible that some of the information that it contains may have come from the data we make available for free to campaigns. He's like, no, we didn't do it, but maybe we did. It's like, okay. So a third party took what they could and really ran with it. That's terrifying. Time to change your email. Again, in. Number 4, psychoelectronic weapons. Yeah, this sounds like something Iron Man uses. It doesn't sound too chill now, does it? Psychoelectronic weapons. The first time Curtis Waltman heard of these was by accident, as you could have guessed. He was receiving documents via Yahoo and they were not what he expected. See, originally he had filed a Freedom of Information Act request to Washington State Fusion Center. See, he was trying to find out more on the clashes between Antifa and the far right, but he got a response and it was all about experimental weapons. Guy gets a zip file back in return called EM Effects on Human Body. He's like, Big Shiny Tune 6? He's like, what? I didn't ask for this. Way too many viruses in that one. Big Shiny Tune 7, I think, was the good one. That's the good one. In this document, he saw diagrams on these weapons and the effects that they have on people. There's muscle quaking, all body pain. One of the effects allowed users to control their dreams. Is this a weapon? This is pretty remarkable. This was clearly sent by mistake. The only emails I get are student loans, and those ones are not by mistake. Those ones are definitely on purpose. They're like, Mr. Taylor. I'm like, oh God, they found me. Number 3, quantum computer. This next one's pretty eye-opening. Here we go. Computers are getting more and more advanced by the day. Deepfakes are also getting way too good. I've fallen for way too many fake trailers. I thought they were doing a Back to the Future reboot with Tom Holland and Robert Downey Jr. for like 4 days. All fake. Whole thing's fake. But thanks to our man Snowden, the OG secret revealer, it was reported in the Washington Post on January 2nd, 2014, that the NSA is working hard at creating their own computer. Yeah, how fun must that one be? I wonder if it can run Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 without getting hot. No computer can do that. It's called the quantum computer and it costs about $80 million to create this program. This computer is safely stored in a massive room-sized metal box, not intimidating at all. It's part of a program called Penetrating Hard Targets. So it can break encryptions for just about anything. Finance records, medical, your old MSN, hopefully, maybe, probably, definitely not. What a nightmare that would be. The NSA is well on their way to breaking every form of public encryption. This quantum computer can theoretically break through any RSA encryption, which for the average computer today, that takes years. This supercomputer they're working on can break through a lot faster. You can get through in days, even hours. So you better clear that search history now while you still can. Thanks for the hot tips, Snowden. I was gonna switch to PC gaming, but you know what? I'll wait it out. I'll wait till this new one comes out. It looks a little faster. Number 2, WikiLeaks war logs. Companies have to be somewhere, right? We're in a film studio in Toronto. We go to a certain place. We leave said certain place in a said certain area. Right? Where do places like WikiLeaks live? How do they stay secure? Well, in Stockholm, apparently buried under 100 feet below street level in an old nuclear bunker. That's where. Right next to Pirate Bay. They're neighbors, actually. They knock on the cement walls. Today, it's a facility owned by Swedish internet provider Bahnhof. Now, this is where they keep servers for WikiLeaks, but Julian Assange, frontrunner of this whole operation, his hard drive is in this bunker behind a 2-foot steel door accompanied by numerous backup generators, so he's secure. In October 2010, WikiLeaks actually published Army field reports from 2004 to 2009. Now, it's one of the biggest leaks in US history. This report confirmed that there were over 66,000 civilian deaths in the Iraq war logs out of the 109,000 confirmed in total. That's horrible. This leak also suggested that some American troops were classifying civilians as enemies in their statistics afterwards. These numbers were from 2004 to 2009. One of the biggest leaks in US history, no doubt about it. And finally, number 1, Watergate. Yeah, it's not an internet leak, but it's too good to talk about. This is OG, come on. We have to finish on Watergate. In the middle of 1972, there were 5 men who were all arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Now, it was pretty obvious they intended on bugging the place. They looked like spy kids. They had all the gears. They were, it was fishy. As the year went on, the election came closer and closer, and then all of a sudden, out of the woodwork comes this anonymous source who fed information to Washington Post reporters that apparently the Watergate bugging incident was a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage kicked off by none other than President Nixon himself. Yeah, he was trying to get that re-election. Now, despite this information leak and it being reported in the news and all that good stuff, Nixon was still re-elected, even though he was involved in this entire scandal. These men were clearly linked to a fundraising group for Nixon, but his administration just kept denying any involvement. It wasn't until a year later, in 1972, when reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, they also came forward and exposed more stuff. Yeah, they exposed the administration's role in this entire scandal, and they had an inside source, an FBI agent named Mark Feltz, and this ultimately led to Nixon resigning later in 1974, the first president to do so.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have the Teapot Dome scandal. Ah yes, what's a list of cover-ups without a good old story of bribery? Albert Fall was the Secretary of the Interior to former President Warren G. Harding, and while in this position, he decided to secretly allow oil companies to tap into the Teapot Dome oil reserve in Wyoming and the Elk Hills oil reserve in California. Of course, the reason he did it is because he could make a ton of extra money doing this, like several $100,000 $100,000. This all started to unravel though in 1922 when there was an expose that revealed the oil had been sold without any sort of competitive bidding. After this expose, Robert La Follette, who is a senator in Wisconsin, created an investigation into this story by the Senate Committee on Public Lands. The Attorney General at the time, Harry Dowdy, began to get some flack for not investigating this alleged corruption, so Harry turned to the FBI director to help him out. The FBI director, William J. Burns, sent an agent to Robert, the senator from Wisconsin's, office to search for anything that could have been used to blackmail him into stopping the investigation into the corruption. Despite this seemingly obvious threat, Robert knew this meant that his investigation was going to reveal something serious, which motivated him to continue on with it. In the end, the shady dealings and bribery was revealed and Albert Fall was officially exposed. This entire ordeal led to him being the first United States cabinet secretary to go to prison. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Dreyfus Affair. In 1984, France's government and their army were in some hot water for a series of scandals that had recently happened when a janitor discovered papers that revealed just another scandal to add to the list. This janitor had found papers in a garbage bin of a German military ambassador that revealed that there was a French officer who had turned against them and who was spying on the Germans. When this came to light, they needed a way out of the mess, so they decided to use a scapegoat, a man named Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred was a Jewish officer in the French army, and they decided to accuse him of this spying and the selling of secrets. His trial was huge in the media, and he ended up being sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, and really hateful and prejudiced groups used his as an example of a quote-unquote unpatriotic Jewish person. Later, the chief of military intelligence would uncover evidence that proved who the real spying culprit was, but when this happened, the chief of military intelligence was removed from his position by his superiors to try and keep the secret from getting out. It is said that French authorities tried to suppress these accusations, but a novelist named Émile Zola continued to accuse the army of a cover-up. People were torn at this point. Some people swear that Alfred was still to blame, while others were convinced he was innocent. In the end, the fight became more about principle rather than whether or not Alfred was really innocent or not. There were 12 years of controversy surrounding this case until Major Hubert Joseph Henry ended up admitting to forging the key documents before taking his own life. The case was finally reopened, and while Alfred was found guilty again, he soon received a pardon from the president. A few years after this, a civilian court of appeals found Alfred innocent, and he went on to have quite an army career, and he even fought with honor in the First World War. This was a scandal that really did change French politics forever. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Ford Pinto. Introduced in 1971, the Ford Pinto would go on to become the car with the worst safety reputation, but of course, not without an attempt to cover up all of the flaws first. During the car's development, during the final stages, there was crash testing being conducted, and this is when designers found out a flaw with the car. Basically, through their tests, they found that the fuel tank's filler neck had a tendency to be torn away, which would then spill gasoline under the car, as well as the fact that the tank itself was able to be easily punctured by nearby bolts. To fix this issue, it would have cost about $11 per car, but instead of spending that money, they decided to just do nothing. Yeah, they just said F it and figured that it would cost less to pay off the people who bought the car and had the issues that caused their car to catch fire. Sounds absolutely insane, and thankfully, an investigative reporter by the name of Mark Dowie thought so too. He went through a ton of paperwork that lay in the US Department of Transportation's file cabinets, and this is when he found what he was looking for. A memo where the company calculated that settling the lawsuits brought against them would save the company $70 million rather than just installing the new parts and fixing the issue for everybody's safety and well-being. Mark wrote an expose on the story, and once published, a jury in Orange County, California awarded $125 million in damages to a man who'd been injured in a Pinto that caught fire. The ruling was later reduced to just $3 million, but it did kickstart the end of the car and the beginning of the scrutiny that the company would face. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Prohibition poisoning. You probably already know about the Prohibition era, but if not, this was a time period where there were restrictions placed on the consumption of alcohol, which was done with a ban being placed on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol by the US government, and this lasted from 1920 to 1933. In knowing about the prohibition comes the knowledge that this ban certainly did not stop people from producing or consuming alcohol, it was just done in sneakier ways. The black market for alcohol was booming as people began to drink redistilled industrial alcohol instead. This is all pretty well known, but one super sketchy thing that is definitely less well known is something that government agencies did to curb the black market sales of alcohol. Basically, they poisoned the industrial alcohol that was being repurposed for drinking, and not just poisoned in a way where the drinker would get sick, which is already horrendous enough, but they poisoned the alcohol with lethal chemicals. It is thought that by the time the prohibition ended, at least 10,000 people died from this. This event is still one of the strangest and deadliest decisions made by government officials. In our number 6 spot today, we have the health risk denial. In this day and age, everyone knows that smoking cigarettes isn't great for your health, but back in the day, people didn't know, and the tobacco industry did everything they could to make sure that they never found out. In 1950, a physician and epidemiologist, Dr. Ernest Winder, published a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association that pointed out the links between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. This is something that is well known and studied now, but at the time this was news to much of the public, and to hide it, 6 major cigarette companies began to fund their own research efforts in response to the study. The study wasn't aimed at actually getting to the bottom of the health risks, it was just a research project meant for publicity reasons. In reality, they already knew about the health hazards and that there was a possible link to cancer. In a 1953 survey of scientific literature, a man named Cloud Teague, who was a chemist for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, concluded that, quote, studies of clinical data tend to confirm a link between the heavy use of cigarettes and lung cancer. A scientist for a major tobacco company at the time knew and had studied the links, and they were still trying to cloud the public perception of this huge issue. The entire strategy was later revealed in a 1972 industry memo, which described it as, quote, creating doubt about the health charge without actually denying it. Finally, this madness was brought to an end, sort of, when the attorney generals from 46 states joined together in one massive lawsuit against the tobacco industry. As a result of this, while they can continue to make their harmful product, in 1998 the companies agreed to pay $10 billion annually to make up for the damage that they had done. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Chernobyl disaster. In April of 1986, crew members of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine were running a test to see how long a reactor's turbines would continue to supply power in the event of an electrical power outage. This test, however, went famously wrong due to a malfunction caused by a power surge. This caused overheating of the water inside of the reactor, which released a buildup of steam and thus explosions. These explosions caused radioactive debris and gas to be released into the atmosphere for the following 10 days. The story of Chernobyl is famous now, as it is one of the largest nuclear disasters in history. There were immediate deaths and more that followed shortly after, but there also has been a countless number of effects seen throughout the years it's been, and the area still remains dangerous due to the contamination. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, however, Soviet officials, because at the time Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union, they didn't publicly admit that the accident had happened at all. For 2 days, they kept totally quiet about this extremely dangerous thing, and it only came out when Swedish officials rang the alarm bells as they had found increased levels of radiation that had drifted 1,000 kilometers westwards over to them. You think at this point they would have just fessed up, but of course not. The Soviet leader at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, waited 3 weeks before even publicly mentioning the accident. Who knows what level of effect this might have had in a multitude of ways. In our number 4 spot today, we have the safety cover-up. Karen Silkwood was an American chemical technician and a labor union activist who was very vocal and often raised concerns about the corporate practices that related to the health and safety of those working in a nuclear facility. You would think that this is something that all of those working in the field would be concerned about, but apparently not. She worked a job making plutonium pellets and was the first woman on the union's negotiating team, and after, she testified to the Atomic Energy Commission about the things she she was concerned about, it was discovered that she had plutonium contamination on both herself and in her home. Plutonium isn't an issue outside of the body but can easily be ingested or inhaled, which is when it creates a major problem for humans. Karen was driving to meet with a New York Times journalist and an official of her union's national office after deciding to go public with some of her findings, and the people who saw her right before she left for this meeting saw her with a binder full of documentations of her findings. During her trip in her car there, Karen ended up driving off of the road and striking a culvert, and this accident took her life. Here's where things get really suspicious though. That binder I just mentioned was never found. It was said that Karen had fallen asleep at the wheel and that almost twice the recommended dosage of methaqualone was found in her system. But there were clear skid marks on the road which suggested Karen was trying to get the car back straight on the road, and despite the accident being entirely at the front of the car, there was damage to the back of the car that friends and family say wasn't there before, and paint chips were found which would suggest a car had hit her from behind. To make this whole thing even more suspicious, apparently Karen was receiving death threats before her passing. There have of course been claims of foul play and claims that she was run off the road by another vehicle, but unfortunately with little to no evidence these claims have never been able to be proven for sure. But what is for sure is that whatever really happened to Karen, it seems like a simple accident doesn't cover the full truth. In the end, however, because of everything that went on with Karen, the Department of Energy opened an investigation and ultimately shut down the facility. In the end, although it is so horrible that Karen lost hers, she definitely saved countless others' lives. In our number 3 spot today we have the Pentagon Papers. In June of 1971, the New York Times published a few different excerpts that were taken from a top secret Department of Defense report that pertained to the United States and their involvement in the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1967. These papers were created as a part of a study by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and the reason they were so important and secret is because they revealed that 4 consecutive presidential administrations had lied to and misled both Congress as well as the American people about their involvement in the war. Daniel Ellsberg, who is said to have been a military analyst who opposed the war, leaked these confidential government records, and him, as well as the New York Times and the Washington Post, all faced criminal charges in court for their efforts to get the papers into public knowledge, but in a turn of events the charges were later dismissed. Not only were these papers important, but the leak was a crucial moment in time because it bred major distrust in the United States government that would only go on to grow. In our number 2 spot today we have Operation Paperclip. I suppose this is less of a cover-up and more of just a secret operation, but this one was kept a secret not for the safety of the people, but instead to prevent an uproar from the public. This operation began in 1946 when the President of the United States at the time, Harry Truman, authorized it. Basically, the entire point of it was to lure scientists from Germany over to the United States after the Second World War. This was done in an effort to aid the country in their post-war efforts, as well as to ensure that the valuable knowledge these people had would not end up in the hands of perhaps the Soviet Union or either side of the divided East and West Germany. Had it not been classified information at the time, this would have been highly controversial, as many of these people were involved in, and sometimes even leaders of that hateful party we won't mention by name again. Former President Truman stood by his decision, saying that because of the relations with the Soviet Union, quote, this had to be done and was done. Several of the scientists a part of this program were later investigated because of their former ties, but one was only ever tried out of the over 1,600. None of the paperclip scientists were ever found guilty for any crimes either in the United States or in Germany. Perhaps the most famous of all of the paperclip scientists was Wernher von Braun, who really played a huge role in advancing NASA's Apollo missions. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Watergate scandal. It's perhaps one of the largest scandals and leaks in history, especially in the history of the United States. In the middle of 1972, there were 5 men who were arrested for breaking into and subsequently trying to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington, D.C. As the year went on, the 1972 presidential election came closer, and there was an anonymous source who fed information to Washington Post reporters that, quote, the Watergate bugging incident stemmed from a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage conducted on behalf of President Nixon's re-election and directed by officials of the White House. Despite this information leak and it being reported on the news, Nixon was still re-elected, but he was also under serious investigation. There was a series of Senate hearings, and the Senate even went on to create a special investigative committee. The hearings were broadcast nationwide, and they had witnesses testifying that Nixon had approved plans to cover up administration involvement in the break-in, and that there was a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office office. These hearings captured the attention of Americans everywhere for weeks, and in the end, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to release these Oval Office tapes to government investigators, which then went on to reveal that he had not only attempted to cover up what went on, but he also later tried to use federal officials to deflect the investigation. Under the threat of an imminent impeachment, Nixon had no choice but to admit his guilt and resign, making him the only president to do so. His successor, Gerald Ford, ended up pardoning him, so he escaped prosecution, but there were 69 other people indicted, with 48 of them later being convicted.
Number 10. Back pain. We'll kick this list off with a horrific prison deal, okay? Around the early 1970s, a lot of experiments rather, they would involve prisoners. And more often than not, they were considered horrible and inhumane. Congressional hearings in 1973 revealed some shady stuff about these pharmaceutical industry. Officials were actually using prisoners for testing because they were cheaper than chimpanzees at the time. Yeah, they were cheaper than animal testing. That's a loaded sentence. That's all bad right there. Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia specifically, they were a hot one. They did this a lot, sadly. Edward Yusef Anthony, a prisoner at the time who was actually featured in a book about all these horrible studies, he says he agreed to have a layer of skin peeled off of his back, which was then coated with searing chemicals in order to test this pharmaceutical. He did that for money to buy cigarettes in prison. It's terrible. He recalled weeks of intense itching and agonizing pain. I can't even imagine. All while serving time too. That's like the most bad. That's all bad. Number 9, Guatemala studies. The Guatemala study is, again, horrible, as are all of these in this list, but I can't even imagine dealing with something life-altering already, like a prison sentence, and then having to be a test subject on top of that. This is just torture at that point. The study began in 1946. American scientists gathered not just prisoners, but patients as well, all residing in a mental hospital in Guatemala. They were then infected with syphilis in order to test whether penicillin could prevent STDs. The study was, of course, useless. It led to nothing but sickness for those that were forced to be involved. In a lot of these cases, many patients didn't fully understand what was happening. They couldn't give their full consent, of course. That's why they sadly went to them. Because nobody in their healthy mind would ever agree to something like this, ever. It's disgusting. Number 8, Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 71 conducted horrific experiments during World War II that definitely make the list. These experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was gruesome, of course, and extremely inhumane. Different medical schools and even universities provided these doctors and other research staff all to help conduct these experiments. It was a nice group effort done, and they used both prisoners and, again, civilians who didn't fully understand as subjects. There were a bunch of different experiments here that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them purposely with pathogens. They would purposely inject them with cholera or anthrax or perform operations without using any anesthesia. It was the worst of the worst. It all happened in Unit 731. Number 7, stomach test. Okay, I'll try and keep this list a little bit of a lighter note here. I'll try and bump it up a bit. This one's not as bad, if such a thing exists. Back in 1822, a fur trader in Michigan was accidentally hit in the stomach. But the trader was lucky to be treated by one Dr. William Beaumont. The fur trader survived, which already was a surprise given the, damage. But now they had this opened hole. They had this wound in his stomach that never heals. Now, this once in a lifetime opportunity allowed a good peek at the digestive process. I feel so sick. I had breakfast 14 minutes ago. Awesome. So Dr. Beaumont began conducting experiments. He's like, let's use this horrible situation for science. He wanted to know how the stomach works, so he would tie food to a string and then insert said yum-yums through the hole in the trader's stomach. And then every few hours he would just pop the food out to observe how it had been digested. I feel so sick talking about this. Now that's the grossest thing I've ever heard personally, but these experiments did lead us to a worldwide knowledge that digestion was a chemical and not a mechanical process. So, guy's just stuffing pierogies in homeboy's stomach. He's like, someone ate it. I'm gonna throw up. Number 6, Operation Midnight Climax. Sounds like a funny name, but it's really not funny at all. Back in the 1950s, the CIA launched Operation Midnight Climax, ideally to study the effects of mind-altering substances on individuals. So in San Francisco and New York, subjects who again did not give consent or really know what was happening, they were tricked into participating. They were lured into safe houses by the, ladies of the night, but these women were actually secretly on the CIA's payroll. Yeah, they were calling in. They would work for the CIA secretly. They would give out these mind-altering substances, and then they would secretly watch from behind one-way glass. class. This was all found out and later thankfully shut down in 1965, and the CIA was busted for 1. Blackmail, 2. Surveillance technology, and 3. The use of mind-altering substances on the field. Now, can't do any of those. Number 5. Bobby, Eddie, and David. When Bobby Shafran was 19 years old, he found out that he had a twin this whole time. He found out he had a brother named Eddie. Now, this is usually fun, but, well, hang on here. The two were raised separately because they had been adopted at birth into different households, of course. But not too long after finding out about each other, things took a crazier turn when Bobby and Eddie found out they had another twin, a triplet rather, another brother named David. So it should have been a very joyous reunion for these triplets turned dark when they began to uncover the truth about what happened and why they'd spent all those years not knowing that each other existed this whole time. They were forced to be subjects in an experiment that they had no idea was taking place their entire lives, just in the background. Peter Newbar was a psychiatrist who wanted to study nature versus nurture, but he decided to do it in a cruel and unethical way. He believed that twins or triplets had a better chance of thriving in life if they were separated from their pair, and they wanted to prove this by unknowingly separating twins from each other at birth. Luckily, Bobby, Eddie, and David all found each other. Their story is documented in the movie The Three Identical Strangers. Number 4. MK Ultra. Okay, where do I even start with this one? This was a secret CIA project that lasted from 1953 to 1973. It's a very long time. They ran hundreds and hundreds of experiments to US citizens, and they gave them all mind-altering substances, you know, stuff I can't really say, all in attempts to crack mind control, or as they called it back then, information gathering. Nice. Hey, just hit that link down below. We're gonna gather some information. Keep your location on. In the 50s and 60s, around the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviets, Chinese, and North Korean agents were all using mind control, right? Why, of course. That was their best explanation towards these brainwashed prisoners of war in Korea at the time. So these horrible tests were then being conducted in universities, hospitals, and again, even prisons. The happenings of these projects weren't fully known to the public until years after it ended. It was this huge, deep, long secret, and the agency destroyed most MK documents back in '73 when it ended. So we think we know a good amount, but there's probably so much horrible that we have no idea. Facial expressions experiment. Back in 1924, a psychologist at the University of Minnesota, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions and why we do them, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say, sounds a little bit silly. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of all these emotions were all the same. Does happiness look the same on everyone's face? What about sadness? Or fear? Or shock? But what about disgust or anger or excruciating pain? Yeah, all those dark ones too you gotta look at. So he recruited some volunteers from campus and then he painted the lines of their facial muscles black. He then exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions and then compare the results. This is like a DC villain. This is horrible. This is all fine, I guess, except for what the stimuli actually contained. He wanted huge reactions because he included showing them adult films, exposing them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles, and of course he made them do horrible, inhumane things that I can't even talk about here on YouTube. All in the name of facial expressions and if they matched others. Number 2. The Pit of Despair. This experiment was conducted by Henry Harlow and is one of the most controversial on this list. Now, in a sort of mental health study, I guess if you want to call it that, Henry decided to induce depression into monkeys. He took very young monkeys and separated them from their peers and their families and their mothers and put them into an isolation cage that was called the Pit of Despair. They even gave it a sad human name, like why just call it like the test cage. I don't know, so sad. Sometimes the monkeys would stay there for longer, more extended periods, and other times they would be repeatedly separated and put into the cage for multiple, shorter stays. These monkeys all proved to be extremely psychologically disturbed, of course, after the conclusion of this experiment, which should have seemed kind of obvious even before it started. Now, these monkeys were used as a model of human clinical depression, but here's where things get even sadder, dare I say, than they already were. These monkeys were unable to be treated and then rehabilitated. They just stayed depressed. Despite various forms of treatment, they were just unable to get to a place that they would have been had, they not been subjected to a cruel experiment. And finally, number 1, the Aversion Project. During the apartheid era in South Africa, psychologist Dr. Aubrey Levin was put in charge of curing gay men. Now, what I mean by that is that he was in charge of running these cruel experiments that targeted gay men for absolutely zero reason. There's zero science here at all. Guy's just a piece of shit. So sadly, thousands of gay men were imprisoned at the military hospital near Pretoria, and while they were there, they were subjected to electroconvulsive aversion therapy that was said to, again, reorient them, right? Now, part of this cruel therapy involved showing the men photos of naked males, encouraging them to fantasize, and then immediately subjecting them to severe shocks. Again, a horrible experiment that was based on zero scientific knowledge and purely based on hatred that was conducted by one horrible person. Now, once apartheid ended, this guy left South Africa because he was worried about being named as someone who denied people their human rights, but unfortunately he ended up fleeing over to Canada, where he then somehow found work as a doctor, right here in Canada, where we're filming. We'll end on that terrifying note.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Operation Northwoods. This is an operation that comes from the time of the Cold War, and it has to do with the tense relationship that was seen between the United States and Cuba at the time. This is the first time we will be talking about this tense relationship on this list, but it won't be the last. Operation Northwoods, should it have gone forward, would have been a project that saw violence committed against the US and Cuban civilians, with the blame placed on the Cuban government. Messed up, right? These acts would include faked attacks of a high magnitude, the hijacking of planes, the sinking of boats, like really serious stuff. They wanted to do this in order to justify an all-out war with Cuba, but thankfully some people at the time had decided that this likely wasn't the smartest or the best route to take, and the idea was scrapped. For a long time, this was hidden from the public until years later documents were revealed that showed this dark, dark truth. In our number 9 spot today, we have psychic driving. Part of the famous Project MK Ultra, this experiment was conducted by British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, who created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous repeated audio loop of something that is intended to change their behavior. Basically, the patients would be exposed to hundreds of thousands of repetitions of a singular statement through the course of their treatment, and they would also be subjected to paralytic drugs that would subdue them while being exposed to this looped message. Yeah, so the CIA heard about this idea for a treatment and they thought, that sounds cool, and they started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he actually didn't know it was coming from the CIA because they used a front. So Cameron's psychic driving experiments for MK Ultra began to take place in Canada. I guess they said that the aim of the experiments were to get rid of or cure someone of schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. I'm not sure that's how schizophrenia works, but I guess they did. Cameron would subject patients to LSD, paralytic drugs, and electroconvulsive therapy that was 30 to 40 times the normal power. He would also put the experiment subjects into drug-induced comas while exposing them to the repetitive audio. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute for more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and they ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like urinary incontinence, amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents and thought that the interrogators were their parents. It clearly completely altered those who were participating in these horrible and certainly unethical experiments, all up until the experiments ended up being scrapped. In our number 8 spot today, we have Operation Washtub. This operation came to light in 2014 when documents became declassified and more people could learn about this Cold War era operation. Basically, this was a covert mission that had its sights set on Alaska. The plan detailed the training of different people who lived in Alaska. Like, we're just talking ordinary residents. They wanted to train these people to both code and decode and a few other like cool spy tactics. I mean, I would have wanted to be picked so badly. Not that I would have even known it was happening, but you get what I mean. Like, real life spy mission? No problem, I'm in. Basically, the plan was put in place in case the Soviet Union was to invade Alaska, but then these unsuspecting ordinary citizens would use their newly learned espionage techniques to get all the intel they could and secretly relay the information to high-ranking US officials. As we now know, of course, this invasion never occurred, so the contingency plan wasn't needed, but 89 lucky temporary agents were trained just for this purpose. What I would give to be one of them. In our number 7 spot today, we have Operation Midnight Climax. This experiment took place in the 1950s, and it was one of those mind control research projects that was sponsored by the CIA. We've already talked about one. So basically, they wanted to study the effects of LSD, but instead of finding willing participants, which, let's be honest, probably wouldn't have been that difficult, but instead they used non-consenting people who were lured to safe houses by workers who were being paid by the CIA, and then once at these safe houses, they were slipped the drug and monitored from behind a one-way glass. For over a decade, the project gave the government more knowledge about the drug itself and what it does to the mind. It gave the knowledge about surveillance technology and even blackmail. In the end, the project was shut down in 1965 because, I don't really have to explain that one, do I? In our number 6 spot today, we have medication. This is something that is actually seen in military prisons or detention centers such as Guantanamo Bay. Basically, this is more of a practice rather than like an experiment or an operation, but it's the force feeding of illicit or psychoactive chemicals to prisoners, some of whom are then interrogated afterwards. I absolutely do not have to explain why this is unacceptable practice, as it is not only a violation of medical ethics, but also a violation of human rights. Many times, these sorts of chemicals are given without the prisoners being aware of what it is, and sometimes not even being aware that they are ingesting it at all. There was a huge scandal about this one when documents became declassified and it was released that this was something that was going on at Guantanamo Bay. Some of those being kept here were dosed with a heavy psychoactive medication that is known to make a person groggy, and then subjected to interrogations afterwards. In our number 5 spot today, we have Project Horizon. Even before people were going to space, we had big goals in mind for the world of space travel. In 1959, there were plans for a proposed manned military base that would be located, of course, on the moon. This plan, which was dubbed Project Horizon, would, quote, develop and protect potential United States interest on the moon, as said in now declassified documents. It was estimated at the time to cost about $6 billion, and the projected operational date was December of 1966, which is when they thought that they could have 12 soldiers on base by. The project not only wanted to study more about the surface of the moon, but what better of a place to spy on Earth than our friendly little neighbor up there in the sky. This project, of course, never came to fruition, and the reason it stopped progressing was because the president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, rejected it at the same time that the responsibility for America's space program was being transferred over to NASA. In our number 4 spot today, we have heavy consideration. Presidential duties certainly are not easy, and making big, important decisions is likely a very nerve-wracking experience that you'd probably want as much information as possible for. That is exactly why, around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Maxwell Taylor wrote a memo at the request of the then President John F. Kennedy. The memo was requested because Kennedy wanted to know what the human cost would be of invading Cuba. The declassified memo explained that should Cuban forces use conventional weapons and not tactical nukes, that, quote, our medical plans are drawn up to accommodate up to 18,500 casualties in the first 10 days of this operation. He then also goes on to explain that if these tactical nuclear weapons were in fact used, that, quote, there is no experience factor upon which to base an estimate of casualties. That is absolutely terrifying. The number they could estimate is already more than terrible enough. I truly don't even want to hear the next one. And this is just a glimpse into what the outcome could have been should these sorts of plans have actually gone forward. In our number 3 spot today, we have Project Minaret. This is a document that became declassified in 2013 as a part of the National Security Archives efforts. This historical document describes a sort of watch list of prominent Americans who were critical of the Vietnam War. The document explains that their overseas communications were tapped and listened into by the government from 1967 to 1973, and a quote from the document reads, quote, President Johnson wanted to know if the domestic anti-war movement was receiving help from abroad. The project expanded so much that it went on to include more than 1,600 people, including civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Whitney Young, and Muhammad Ali. There were also people like Democratic U.S. Senator Frank Church of Idaho, Republican Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, New York Times columnist Tom Wicker, and Washington Post humor columnist Art Butchwald. But it continued on through to the Nixon administration. In the end, the only reason it was stopped was because Attorney General Elliot Richardson was concerned about its very doubtful and murky legality and decided during the Watergate scandal that it would be best to shut it down. I mean, They definitely had enough on their plate already at the time, okay? In our number 2 spot today, we have Project 1794. This project was created with the goal to build a sort of saucer-type aircraft that would be designed to shoot down Soviet bombers. The program, which was created in the 1950s, was quite ambitious and had some pretty lofty goals. A team of engineers began trying to build a disc-shaped aircraft, but here's the real kicker. They wanted it to be capable of traveling at supersonic speeds at high altitudes. The documents about this project show that they wanted it to be able to travel at Mach 4, which is 4 times the speed of sound, and they wanted it to be able to reach an altitude of over 100,000 feet. At the time, the project was estimated to cost about $3 million, which is about $26 million today. In the end, the project was cancelled in 1961 because the craft failed tests and proved to be aerodynamically unstable, which of course would provide a whole slew of problems at high speeds, especially supersonic ones. In our number 1 spot today, we have Acoustic Kitty. This is one that I've talked about before, and I'm talking about it again because I just can't believe that it happened. Apparently, in 1967, the CIA was spending millions of dollars trying to make cats into spies. I don't know why they chose the animal that does not care what you want it to do, but alas, they did, and Project Acoustic Kitty was born. The project basically involved implanting electronic spy equipment into real living cats who would then be trained to basically eavesdrop on unsuspecting people. This is another one of those Cold War era plans that was intended to be used on those in the Soviet Union. The project had a whole slew of issues, of course, however, because cats get hungry and distracted, and unfortunately the first time this plan was being tested, there was a catastrophic outcome. No pun intended. I just said catastrophic. Get it? The project, of course, is cancelled, and the researchers said that they believed they could train cats to move short distances, but that, quote, the environmental and security factors in using this technique in a real foreign situation forces us to conclude that for our intelligence purposes, it would not be practical. And I think that was probably a very good decision. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the Salem UFO. On the morning of July 16th, 1952, this photo was captured by Shell Alpert and has stumped people ever since. The photo shows 4 unidentified objects hovering in the air above Salem, Massachusetts, and was taken at the Salem Coast Guard Air Station. The objects seem to be above the Winter Island and Cat Cove areas, but there really isn't much more that is known about this strange incident. There are a few theories regarding this photo. One is a camera glitch, others think it may just be light reflecting off of the window that the photo was taken through, but of course there are people who point to similar incidents that happened in the 1950s, and of course believe it is proof of extraterrestrial beings. It is very likely we may never know exactly what's going on here, but the air of mystery it leaves is definitely kind of cool. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Frozen Man of Mount Everest. This photo comes from 1996, and it shows Beck Weathers getting treated after the Mount Everest disaster. The Mount Everest disaster took place on May 10th and 11th in 1996, where there was a blizzard on the mountain that ended up stranding and taking the lives of 8 people who were aiming to descend the mountain. Beck was a part of the team who was climbing the mountain on this fateful day, and he ended up suffering from snow blindness during the climb. He actually fell into a hypothermic coma because it was so cold, and he suffered severe frostbite on his face, hands, and feet. Pretty miraculously, he not only survived, but ended up walking back down to camp in order to get help, where he was then taken by helicopter to receive treatment. He ended up needing his hands, parts of his feet, and even his nose amputated, but he survived this whole ordeal, and that is the most important thing. In our number 8 spot today, we have the reflecting pool. This is one of the creepiest or most chilling images ever taken. It depicts a young girl in a graveyard who is looking down at a reflection in a pond. Okay, maybe a little eerie, but not exactly chilling. What makes this photo what it is, however, is that there are seemingly 2 reflections looking back up at this little girl. No one knows who this girl is, where she is, or even when this photo was taken, but it is estimated to have come from somewhere around the early 1900s. This photo was analyzed, and it has been said that it is unaltered or edited. Who knows how this photo was possible? Maybe there was some sort of invisible entity standing beside her that we could only see the reflection of, like a reverse vampire or something. In our number 7 spot today, we have the elephant's foot. This photo looks like it's just a big lump of nothing, but it is called an elephant's foot. No, it's of course not a real elephant's foot, and instead is just called that because of its appearance. This lump was actually created from the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown, and it is just a mass of corium and other materials that were in the core of the reactor. This elephant's foot was located in the steam distribution corridor, which is under what's left of the reactor. While this mass doesn't produce as much radiation as it did before, it does still produce a deadly amount even today. Like, so much so that just a few minutes of being around it is enough to get a lethal dose of radiation. It's kind of crazy that even though they knew this, they were still standing there taking pictures of it. For a long time, the severity of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster was being kept a secret from the public and those who it mattered to the most. Photos like these only give us a glimpse into this horrible disaster and how things went down. In our number 6 spot today, we have the penitentiary. This photo comes from what is left of the Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. This prison used to be the most famous and the most expensive in the world, but now this is the sort of thing that is left of it. This prison is actually now used as a tourist attraction, and it becomes a haunted house during Halloween. The prison used to house some pretty high-profile prisoners, such as Scarface himself, Al Capone. The prison was opened in 1829 and was known for its advanced technology for the time. They had things like central heating, flush toilets, and shower baths in each cell. These were all considered luxuries in 1829. The first prisoner to be held there was Charles Williams, who was facing a 2-year sentence for theft. When he arrived at the prison, he had a hood over his head so as to protect his identity, but also so that he wouldn't know what the rest of the prison looked like, so he would never be able to plan an escape. While prison is never good, the craziest thing about this specific one is that all of the prisoners lived in isolation. I can't even imagine what that would be like, especially for the people who found themselves there for a long period of time. This photo is just a truly haunting reminder of all that once went on in this prison. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. This photo comes from 1971 during the Stanford Prison Experiment. For those of you who aren't familiar with this experiment, it started on August 14th, 1971 and was led by university psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. The experiment took student volunteers and divided them into 2 groups, one group of prisoners and one group of guards, and they placed all of the volunteers into a fake prison that was created for this experiment. The experiment aimed to see if and how quickly humans would turn evil under the right conditions with the right amount of power. Basically, it was a test to try and answer the question of if humans are inherently good or inherently evil. I think everyone was pretty shocked with the results. After just 6 days, the experiment needed to be concluded because the guards began absolutely tormenting the prisoners. It really showed the kinds of things humans can be capable of, even after a short time. This photo is definitely reminiscent of that experiment, and it serves as our reminder. In our number 4 spot today, we have the acid drum. This photo comes to us from the inside of a house of one of the most terrible people, the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. This photo was taken from the inside of his home after he was found and caught by authorities. Before his arrest, he was sadly able to take the lives of 17 people. Although this photo might look kind of plain, the horrors are plentiful. This shot shows a full drum of acid that was located inside of his home. I probably don't need to tell you what it was used for, because who has a full drum of acid inside of their home? Especially when you're a serial killer. I can't imagine the horrors investigators saw when they entered his home, and even previous to that as they investigated his crimes. Thankfully, Jeffrey was caught, and in 1992 he was sentenced to life in prison, but just 2 years later he was killed by a fellow prison inmate. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Gadget. This photo shows the first ever atomic bomb, and it comes to us from 1945. Called the Gadget, this bomb was an implosion plutonium device that was detonated in the Trinity test in 1945. This photo shows someone sitting next to it, so casually, like it's a stuffed animal and not like it's a world-changing device. The Trinity test was the very first time a nuclear weapon was detonated, and the Gadget was actually of the same design as the bomb that was later detonated over Nagasaki, Japan on August 9th, 1945. There is a very eerie nature about this photo and the seemingly casual behavior of the man next to it. Did he know what this was about to unleash? Perhaps not, but more eerily, Maybe he did. In our number 2 spot today, we have change. This photo was taken by Fred Blackwell on May 28, 1963, and is actually showing us a moment of protest. The 3 sitting at the counter are Joan Trompour, Anne Moody, and their sociology teacher, John Salter. The reason why this photo is so important is because these 3 are sitting at a quote white-only counter at Woolworth's Five and Dime store in Jackson, Mississippi, while being attacked by an angry mob. People are throwing condiments at them, and I'm sure saying some pretty nasty things. The 2 students went to Tougaloo College, which was a black college that ended up being at the core of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. It's amazing to see how brave they are, and a photo like this is really such an important message for us to remember today. In our number 1 spot today, we have Bikini Island. Bikini in the Marshall Islands was once inhabited by around 170 islanders until 1945 rolled around. The US president at the time, Harry Truman, ordered that the military continue to test nuclear weapons just in case they were needed in the future, since this was shortly after the end of World War II. Unfortunately, Bikini was the place that was chosen to be the testing site, since all planes and ships traveled on routes that weren't close to the area. The residents of the island were asked to vacate, quote, for the good of mankind and to end all world wars, to which they of course obliged, under the impression that they would one day be able to move back. Test weapons were detonated on the reef itself, on the sea, in the air, and underwater, and this photo shows what was happening during just one of these tests, and it wasn't even the largest one. Although the former residents of Bikini were promised that they would one day be able to return home, the island still remains uninhabited because of the mass amounts of radiation that still exist here.